Okay, welcome to today's seminar. Obviously it's on the theme of land and folk, as with the other seminars. Today we have Catherine Morland and Amanda Couch. Catherine and Amanda are both creative practitioners, artists. We've got a bit of a double act, so Catherine I think is going to go first and introduce us to some of her experiences of and engagements with basket making and with traditional craft and ideas around that from her travels in northern Kenya. And then we'll hand over to Amanda, who will be doing exciting things, I think, with this biscuit that I'm very excited about, because we're in, some of you may know this already, we're in what was probably Alfred Palmer of Hunting Palmer's bedroom, Hunting Palmer's being one of the famous wedding companies and a biscuit manufacturing company at that. So lots of intersections with the collections. Catherine and Amanda, over to you.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Catherine Morland and I'm an artist. I'd like to talk a little bit about my work and also the journey my practice has taken since visiting the northern Kenya, is a place called Turkana, and I went there to visit the prehistoric landscapes and also the nomadic tribes who are also called Turkana, who lived there. This kind of led me to come to the MERL here to look at the bastardry collection, and following that to propose a project here with a group of artists about the enclosures of the common land in 17th and 18th century Britain. So it's a personal tale as well as one about the direction of my work. I kind of touched on quite a few subjects as I went along this journey, most of which I'm not really an expert on, but things like ecology, paleontology, social politics, climate change, environmentalism, decolonisation. So experts in any of these topics may consider my treatment slightly lacking in necessary depth, but if I do that, please forgive me. Because I came across all these things in doing my work and while I was there, so they kind of all relevant. So I spent time in Kenya over a period of 3 or 4 years. I had family there, so I was lucky enough to be able to spend some time developing my ideas and also getting to know artists in Nairobi. I spent some time doing a residency at a place called the Kuona Arts Trust and did an exhibition there. I wanted to learn about my country's past connection with Kenya, and this is not an easy subject, whichever way you look at it. I was interested really in the legacy of colonialism, and in my work I started to think about the expatriate gaze in contemporary Kenya. Gated communities, security guards, 4x4s, safaris, beautiful scenery, lush gardens, and also the visual symbolic presence of the development industry, which is everywhere in Nairobi. Fleets of white UN vehicles, signage everywhere for many of the humanitarian and development organisations as well as NGOs, which Nairobi is full of. A new imperialism seems to exist, and as a white European female artist, it was an unusual approach, I think, but it was my only point of arrival. So initially what interested me about Kenya was in fact what conflicted me most about it, and I did constantly question my relationship with this exotic country with a colonial past, and I'm fully aware of what that means, is a dangerous word to use, exotic, but that was where I started. So during my residency in Nairobi, I went to the museum, a National Museum of Kenya, and this is where I started to look at Kenya's ancient past. Africa is where we all come from, after all, and there's plenty of evidence in Kenya of our human origins. For over 40 years, fossil hunters have been excavating hominid fossils, and many of these are in the museum and other archaeological sites around the country. So at this point in my work, I was thinking about what materials and processes to use while I was in Kenya. I've always considered very carefully the materials I use, what their associations are, and what they symbolise. I wanted to use something that I could actually literally take away, rather than kind of a product from the land, rather than using images or documentation. I've been making paper in the UK, and I was interested in the process of making it by hand with plant fibres. The paper is kind of a residue, it's a vestige, it's an end product, and I was interested in those sort of quite primitive qualities of the process. It involves, basically, you cook all the ingredients out, all the impurities, all the organic matter out of the fibres, and what you have left with is the pulp, and that's what you make the paper with. So while I was there, I found a paper making workshop a few hours out of Nairobi, where I made paper from locally harvested plants, including eucalyptus, sugarcane, nettle, banana leaf, and I started to use them in my work, and I started to use them sculpturally, as you can see, rather than as a ground. The paper, I mean, I started to use it as a substance, as a material, rather than something to draw on or paint on, and they became sculptural collages. So at this point, Turkana was my destination. This is a very, very remote county in the northwest of Kenya. It is the hottest and driest place I've ever been to. It's home to over 1 million nomadic livestock herders who have lived successfully there for centuries. This is one of the reasons I wanted to go there. I wanted to see how they lived as contemporary nomads and also to visit a settlement. It's also known as the cradle of mankind, the badlands of Turkana, where huge amounts of human fossils have been found. There's a research centre right in the middle of the desert, and it's called the Turkana Basin Institute. I was desperate to get there, and it's not as easy as it seems. It was set up by Richard Leakey, and it's basically a scientific and research institute. It took me several attempts and several years to get permission. Being an artist really didn't work. It was only for scientists and researchers. As much as I think there's lots of connections between science and art, and there has been around the world, it didn't work here. I did manage to get permission eventually. My brother was working at the time in Nairobi as a journalist. As I said, I had family there, and he was an editor of a humanitarian news agency. And they recently discovered that oil was found in Turkana, so he was doing a piece about the effects this would have on the local population. So I persuaded him to take me on as a researcher, and that's how I got in, basically. And I was just there to ask questions, but I did ask quite a lot of questions. So next pictures are of, this is the area that I'm talking about, which is called the Badlands of Kenya, where a lot of the fossils are found, and where all the teams go out and the field trips. And I was lucky enough to be taken out with a fossil hunter who showed me in the 40 degrees heat. But it was amazing. So one thing that's important to point out, that at this time I was a new mother when I went to Kenya, and I was having conflicts that I realise now that many women have when they have a child and they're an artist. It's basically how it's going to work, and how you can be a mother and an artist. And it's something that I think a lot of people contend with. I was happy to throw away the old age assumption that a woman's creativity is taken over by her sort of biological duty to have children. But because I know that was nonsense, but I can see where the assumption came from. Basically, you have a child and you nurture it, and you have an art practice and you nurture it, and they both need nurturing in the same place, and something somewhere's got to give, and that's where the conflict comes in. And I was annoyed to be fighting what I saw was this sort of male argument that your maternal sensibility is almost like an obstruction to creativity. I mean, I can think of many more things that were obstruction. Housework, for instance, domestic labour. I mean, in a way, domestic labour and making art are kind of pretty similar. I mean, economically, they're not valued and outside of the workforce. So there was I with these two things juggling, which really weren't viable as a practice in terms of making money, and I was trying to be an artist. So yeah, that was what I was thinking about at the time, and it was important that I was here at that point. So certainly when I arrived in Turkana and spent some time in this landscape, I did start to get some perspective. This is all images of I have to stop here, because that on the left is which I touched, was a dinosaur, 3 million year old dinosaur, and that was in the sand pit on the left. And this is pictures of the research centre, which with all the specimens and boxes, and amazing place. So I guess it could have been anywhere, but there was something about it and what it represented when I visited Turkana that was pretty awe-inspiring. There was something that seemed very permanent and stable and regular, that was very appealing and quite at odds with the life I was just started with a young child. So, on a drive through the desert to get to this place, we came across several Turkana settlements, and we stopped to visit a few. This was amazing, but not always the most comfortable experience, and reception was kind of mixed. It felt quite invasive to take pictures, and in some places there was understandably visible hostility to this. I learnt a lot, however, especially when I was shown around a homestead by a group of women. Traditionally, the women and girls do cooking, gathering, fetching water, and constructing, repairing and living huts, which are these. I was interested in the materials they used, which is basic materials that they find that grow nearby. So, for instance, the huts would be made out of flexible acacia branches, and some of the, I think in the next image, there's some of these are structures for storage, for inside the cooking hut, and these are used different type. This might be used different parts of the tree, and palm leaves as well as used. So I was quite interested in I think doom palm was one of them. It's used for the outside of the hut. I was quite interested in all these materials and what they were using, as they were sort of a domestic activity. So these huts had to be like dismantled quickly because they were on the move. I mean, they stayed in one place for a short period of time, but one group of the settlement would stay with the huts, and the others would go out with the herds. So there's a lot involved in it. What I was interested in the bottom left-hand one is in that picture, which is like a little shelf inside it. There's like 3 or 4 or maybe 5 different types of cordage. Now, cordage is like what we know as string, but that's all handmade. And the cordage, in a way, is a really interesting. It's an interesting material because it's made from all the. It's quite a necessary material. It's probably, I see it as technology, basically, and early technology. So, so these are what I was looking at. I didn't start using basketry immediately in my work, but it was seeing what these women were making as part of their domestic activities that kind of triggered my interest in it a few years later. When I started looking at natural processes and materials, including weaving, knots, basketry, and cordage. As I said, I was interested in basketry being technology. In fact, I'm almost interested in why it's not seen as technology. If you think about fossils and how they're made, it's quite rare that anything turns into a fossil. And the things, if you think about it, all the organic stuff and all the things that were made out of plants and wood would not have survived. But I think I'd spent quite a lot of time looking at stone tools and hand axes, which do survive. And in fact, I'm probably getting my centuries and years mixed up, but I think discovering basketry, discovering cordage, which probably was discovered before basketry, was pretty vital. So that's what I was interested in. I wasn't so much interested in making the perfect basket, but I was. So I'm not really the ideal craftswoman in that way. But I was interested in using lots of different materials and seeing how they work. This is cordage, for instance, made out of different materials. It's more difficult, do you think, to make something using basket that isn't a traditional round shape. So that was what interested me. I used materials that I could harvest, like daffodil leaves, cosmea leaves, daylily, pine needles, anything that I could find, really. And this is an example of all the different types of basket that I tried. So at this point, I started to incorporate some weaving and basketry techniques into my sculptures. I also used some found objects that I found as I came back to the UK and I went to visit the Jurassic Coast. So I picked up fossils, bits of driftwood, prehistoric rock, and I think in some of the early pictures you could see some of those that I incorporated into my work. So this is my most recent work, and that's where I'll sort of finish on images of my work. But finally, I wanted to say there's another aspect of Turkana which has connections here to the MERL. When I was there and spent a bit of time speaking to people and also speaking to my brother about all the everything's been written about it, Turkana is mainly communal land, and where people farm, where the nomads live. This land is not owned by anyone, but managed and regulated by the community living on it. In this case, it's the Turkana pastoralists. This remote area has been marginalised over the years by colonial and post-colonial governments. The British saw no value in their land and left them alone. Post-independent governments followed the European model. So Turkana really has been seen as backward, unproductive, and not economically viable. So any initiatives over the years were kind of to move pastoralism away into sedentary livelihoods and ultimately jobs and wage labour. The focus, if any, was on helping them to progress to modernity. So if anyone's familiar with Hardin's A Tragedy of the Commons, written in 1968, this will all start sounding quite similar to that. Garrett Hardin's belief was that the overuse of common lands leads to exploitation, and this has led to policies of land grabbing and privatisation of common land all over the world. This took me back to where it all started in Britain in the 17th and 18th century, with the enclosure of the commons and the collection here at the MERL. So, but going back to Turkana at the present day, it's interesting now what's starting to happen. Firstly, it's important to realise, well, I think it's amazing that Turkana way of life still exists, with little investment, no state support, and persistent drought, some of which is due to climate change, some not, and which often results in famine conditions. But pastoralism is a specialist mobile system of raising animals. This ancient knowledge about different breeding techniques, weather patterns, and intricate knowledge about plants and animals is acquired over centuries. The nomads are familiar with drought and employ traditional drought early warning systems themselves, including wind and bird movement, cloud patterns, and even the observation of livestock intestines. So, in the past, the push to modernise here has really meant getting kids to school, get a job, and abandon pastoralism. Even when I spoke to scientists at the TBI, they dismissed my romantic notions. I had just described to them how I'd been to visit these settlements, and they were like, Turkana kids can't be goat herds, they've got to go to school. And I kind of realised that gave me a bit of a shock, that I had spent all my ideas about it were. But recently I've been reading that the Turkana pastoralists have actually been more demanding. They want to create a new generation of educated pastoralists. If the children can't get to school, perhaps the school system needs modernising. Schools could come to them, using audio files, radio programs, visiting tutors. Pastoralists want their specialised business of dry land animal production to be recognised as a viable livelihood. And this can happen by understanding and enabling pastoralism rather than viewing it as archaic and inefficient. So this means political support and economic support. I mean, for instance, everyone was using mobile phones. All the information gained over centuries could be made available using technology. And I started looking at a crowdsourcing platform called Ushahadi, which actually does exactly this. It gains information from groups. It started by using information about the violence that happened in Kenya in the elections, but actually it's being used now to gain information. It could be something that could be used for this reason, getting information from everybody in the area, and use it as a mapping platform. As far as I know, none of this has happened yet, but once people start looking at the possibilities, anything can happen, really. So I guess that last bit was just me thinking how, in terms of moving on my work, I'm kind of interested in combining ancient technologies and with contemporary ones. In a way, it's about looking to the past to think about the now and strategies for our future. So yeah, that's my any questions time. Hi.
I was just interested in, you used the word badlands at the beginning, and I was wondering when that term first came in and whether it was to do with climatic and geographical factors, or whether it was to do with the marginalisation that you were just describing.
I think it's to do with climatic, because when I was emailing about trying to visit this place, they talked a lot about the badlands as a scientific term rather than, I like the sound of it because it sounds like Bruce Springsteen song, but it is to do with the
because it's a term that's used in lots of different countries, you know, for instance, lava fields and things like that. I just was interested how it first.
I don't know the answer to that question, but as far as I know, it's used as a term for referencing the type of rock or the type of landscape that is good for finding fossils. So you could be right, it could be something that's, I don't, what you mean, so badlands could be something derogatory?
Yes, I mean, you know, because you were describing this marginalisation, and sort of, you know, negative.
Yeah, I'm wondering, I don't know, I think not. I think maybe it's a term that's used all over the world for areas that can be where fossils can be found.
It has become a sort of politically contentious term in some places, and I think possibly in northern Kenya as well, but I don't think it's a...
I was trying not to be.
But
No, that's interesting, I'd like to find out,
because the badlands are different, and they're called badlands for different reasons in different countries.
Yeah.
You know, like, so I just wondered.
I mean, the term was used in communication to me about where I was going to go and what. So yeah, I didn't even think about it being something that maybe.
It's a commonly used term though, but I think I mean you referenced the 40-degree heat, and you know there.
You're right. Yeah, not easily.
It's a harsh and difficult part of the world to live in. So I think that's part of why that name emerges.
Yeah, but whether or not all areas that you can find fossils have that sort of degree of harshness, I don't know. But yeah.
Any other questions or thoughts? We can always gather some more questions at the end. So shall we move on to you?
Yeah, should we open the, I'm not using the slides, so
Open these.
yeah. I'm Amanda Couch. I'm an artist and I'm a lecturer at the University for the Creative Arts in Farnham. I teach fine art there. I'm going to talk about harvest rituals and wheat. Demeter, goddess of grain, agriculture, harvest, growth, nourishment, as well as sacred law. She is the bringer of seasons, reigns over the cycles of life and death, and presides over the fertility of the earth. Because her only daughter Persephone was abducted by Hades, god of the underworld, Demeter was grief-stricken and angry, and searched for her all across the world. A terrible famine gripped the land. Demeter neglected the earth, living things stopped growing and began to die. Confronted by the possibility of the cessation of life on earth, Zeus insisted Persephone be brought back to her mother. Hades agreed, but tricked her into eating a pomegranate seed which bound her to him. And whilst Demeter was overjoyed that her daughter had returned to her, when Persephone descends for part of the year to the underworld, Demeter mourns dreadfully, causing the plants and crops to stop their growth for that time. But when Persephone ascends again, the earth surges forth once more with life. So specialist in Greek philosophy and religion Radek Klup recalls the 20th century anthropologist Bronislaw Malinowski's analysis of garden magic, of the garden magic of the Trobriand Islands, where it was believed that fertility was seen in opposition to agricultural work. He writes, "Fertility is connected with what cannot be achieved by technological means, with the unaccountable and the precarious. It is perceived as an unpredictable power standing outside the reliable structures of man's world. Such rites are means to deal with external powers which are beyond our control, but on which we depend, and by performing rituals, men and women try to domesticate them, at least partly, and bring them onto their side." In botany, cereal or grain is part of the grass family, Poaceae, which bears edible starchy brands or fruit seeds, which I'm going to hand out now to you. Pass around. The word cereal is of mythic descent, coming from Ceres, the goddess of harvest and agriculture, Demeter's Roman counterpart. While its role as a dominant local staple has been reduced in the last 50 years, wheat's role as a global staple has increased. This is claimed by many people, especially Asmund Bjorkstad, a Norwegian professor of genetics and plant breeding, who writes about wheat's role in social and cultural life. Always good. So he says, in local and regional diets, it retains a major influence in our meals. It's 20% of calories in the West. In religion, in language and expressions, and is a social force that may be activated at times of political crisis, seen in Egypt in 2008 and 2011. And our ancestors in the Middle East domesticated grass-derived crops such as wheat and rye, the oldest cereals, about 10 to 12,000 years ago, using them to make bread and a myriad of other baked goods for every occasion. Today, people are embodying the myth of Paradise Past and are turning back to the earliest wheats that we cultivated: einkorn, ema, khorasan and spelt, some of which I'm going to try growing in my garden this year, which the old world grains that are receiving renewed interest by growers, cooks and scientists. In 2011, wheat was the most widely grown crop on the planet, occupying almost a third of the land which was grown where grains were grown. And it's expected that in the next decade it will surpass rice as the world's most important food crop. And such a prophecy may be hard to swallow, what with wheat and particularly its protein gluten's demonization in the Western media. There have been numerous fad-eating regimes that vilify wheat and gluten, the G diet, low-carb Atkins, the wheat belly diet, and scientific studies ranging from the dubious to the legitimate. Obviously, those researching the autoimmune condition celiac disease are a lifesaver for sufferers. And there are also the celebrity endorsements from Beckham, Paltrow, Miley Cyrus, and Kim Kardashian for going gluten-free. But what we think of as a recent demonization of wheat, according to Alan Levanovich, a professor of religious studies, in his book The Gluten Lie and Other Myths About What You Eat, this vilification has its roots in the religious and mythological, being deeply embedded in ideas of good and evil rather than in the medicinal or nutritional. He writes about this myth of Paradise Past, which was a rejection of modernity, the kind of culture and technology which creates and develops our food beliefs. And he recalls that 2,000 years ago, a band of Taoist monks spurned cereals, a symbol of that time of progress and civilization, in the belief that they caused death and disease. But conversely, in the Middle East around the same time, recorded in the Gospel according to John, Jesus apparently called himself the grain of wheat, which was considered the symbol of life of utmost value. So perhaps the vilification of wheat is the grain spirit rearing its head once more after being dormant for a few generations. Since agricultural industrialization, the rise in demand for food, the breeding of higher yield mutants, and methods of reaping has stifled the traditions linked to harvest home, mechanization has substituted the sickle, the scythe, and the large number of hands needed, and harvesting is now performed across the country by an army of lone drivers confined and sealed within combine cabs. As a result, we haven't been practicing last sheaf customs or performing triumphant or celebratory rituals for many generations now. In his book Stations of the Sun, A History of the Ritual Year in Britain, Ronald Hutton writes that the meanings and origins of last sheaf customs have been at the centre of much debate and controversy amongst folklorists. The 19th century German scholar Wilhelm Mandhart, whose ideas were popularised by James Fraser in The Golden Bough, argued that there was a close relationship between the agricultural customs of the Greco-Roman world and those in northern Europe of his time, i.e. in an animistic belief in the corn or grain spirit that was demonstrated by the importance placed on the last bunch or sheaf of the crop, where it was thought that the spirit of the whole field, when cut, was driven into. So just before I go on, just want to clarify the term corn. Some of you obviously will know that it's, know about this, but just to kind of clarify. So when I talk about corn spirits or corn dollies, corn traditionally means grain in this country and in Ireland, not maize or sweet corn. Confusion may lie in the Americanization of the term, which denotes maize in Northern and Southern Americas. So although Hutton argues that amongst late 20th century folklorists, such belief in animistic corn has been disregarded, he does go on to recount numerous examples of last sheaf customs and related activities across the UK and Ireland. Evidence of its belief as to whether the last sheaf was dangerous or a good luck token are split. In many places, the cutting, parading, and even the throwing of the last sheaf into the farmhouse of a neighbouring property was an opportunity to celebrate and gloat that the harvest was done before a rival team or adjacent farm. That there are also instances recorded where people were afraid to be the one to cut the final remaining plants in the field, throwing sickles from behind their backs or being blindfolded so as not to gaze on the last crop. There are also myriad references to the body, and especially the female, in the naming of the last sheaves and the forms that they were made into, where it was thought that the corn spirit would reside until the following year's growth. For example, it was known as the neck, and the maiden, the doll, the kalak, which meant divine hag, Iraq, the hag, or the kesig fedi, excuse my Welsh, which is the harvest mare, and the bride, amongst other names. Sometimes these sheaves are formed into recognisable anatomical figures, perhaps clothed or with ribbons tied around. Sometimes they are abstracted forms or plaited or woven wheat, but often named with references to the female with negative connotations. More often than not, it was considered bad luck or at least an inconvenience to be left with the hag over the winter, being forced to feed and house her. Such a legacy of the fear of women as bad spirits or witches lives on today, for example with Hillary Clinton being named a witch with a B, and with the very real danger that faces accused witches in some parts of the world. A pagan association to the corn goddess of Demeter, Ceres and others must have held at least a grain of truth to some in the Catholic Church, as Hutton recalls. In Somerset, in as late as the 20th century, corn dollies were prohibited from entering the church as decoration for the harvest festival. So there's clearly something that lives on from our pagan magical past that's in these supposedly more enlightened times that's quite fearful. Within my art practice, I'm exploring land, food and the body, and especially the digestive system, alongside theories of interconnectivity through a reinterpretation of ancient rituals. Food grown in the land is taken into the body and through thresholds of the gut becomes us, becomes our body, literally transforming into ourselves. Inside and outside are no longer separated, but intertwined, interconnected and contiguous. In the commensal act, the eating of food, The physiological functions of digestion and absorption collapse human world binaries through the gut, offering a dramatic example of the transactional mingling of organism and environment. So drawing on the many and varied ancient and recent ways to celebrate, make thanks and appease the gods or forces of nature to ensure a good harvest, some of which I've touched on, and the vast majority I don't have time to visit today, I wanted to enact a small ritual with you through the ingestion and burying of wheat. Aiming to link wheat, our bodies, and the land, I'm recalling what Chef Dan Barber declares in the recent film The Grain Divide, that wheat is Western civilization, wheat is who we are. The ritual will draw on the practice of the lammas or loaf mass, the loaves of bread gifted by farmers for communion at the harvest mass made from the new wheat crop. But instead of bread, as Ollie kind of mentioned before, it will be a biscuit, recalling Reading's biscuit making history and the Huntley and Palmer kind of legacy, who at the height of their success at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century were making over 400 varieties in this town. This is not one of them. They didn't do a clat. So I made a biscuit in between a sable and a shortbread from a mixture of sprouted spelt flour and normal plain flour, butter, eggs, sugar, and a dash of vanilla essence, which has been plaited to resemble the corn of a maiden, the form of a corn maiden or corn neck, which will now be passed around by my mother in a moment. So what I want you to do is to break off a nice big piece, and if you would break that piece in half, and if you're not gluten intolerant, I couldn't really do anything about that, to ingest one of the pieces, and then we're going to go down into the garden, we're going to process down into the garden and bury the second half into the garden. In the fertility myth of Persephone and Demeter, Stuart Harris and Gloria Platzner in their book Classical Mythology refer to Persephone as the seed that is planted in the ground, which refers to the underworld, is dampened by the rain, i.e. Zeus's intervention, and then the germination in spring into fully grown grain is Demeter. In my ritual, Persephone is the flower, the sprouted flower, and Demeter is perhaps the fully formed biscuit. And by ingesting and burying fragments of the biscuit, we are enacting the cycle of regeneration by planting them in our bodies, us becoming wheat, and then planting them into the earth to symbolize the possibility of new growth. And finally, in a book of charms and amulets called Leechdom's Wart Cunning and Starcraft of Early England, which tells of the history of science before the Norman Conquest, there is a reference to a similar act performed on the lammas loaf. So that there be a mark of a cross upon it, and take from the hallowed bread, which is hallowed on Lammas Day, 4 pieces, and crumble them on the 4 corners of the barn. So maybe we can go to the 4 corners of the garden and bury them